Welcome law students to this explainer. Today we're diving into the landmark case of Macariola versus Asuncion. If you're tackling your Constitution I syllabus right now, or, just deep into legal ethics and statutory construction, this is an absolute must-know detailed case digest. We're going to break down this complex administrative matter and really zoom in on the exact limits of a judge's power, property rights, and that super fine line between what's strictly legal and what's ethically proper. Let's build a rock-solid understanding so you are perfectly prepared for your next recitation. All right, here's our roadmap for today's case digest. First up, the facts. Second, the issue. Third, the application. And finally, we'll wrap up with the conclusion. Let's jump right in. Part 1. The facts. A property dispute. Now listen, in statutory construction and administrative cases against judges, timelines are absolutely everything. So, let's set the stage. Take a look at this timeline. Notice the pretty significant gaps between the court's actions in 1963, which is when the decision was actually rendered and the partition was approved, and the moment the judge purchased the property way out in March 1965. Keep these dates locked in your head, because the Supreme Court definitely did. Okay, so here's the setup. The respondent, Judge Elias Asuncion, was handling civil case number 3010. This was a property partition case among the heirs of the deceased Francisco Reyes. Now, the complainant in our current administrative case, Bernardita Macariola, was actually one of those heirs. Judge Asuncion issued a decision in June 1963, dividing up the estate properties. That eventually led to a project of partition that he formally approved a bit later that same year. So let's trace the path of the specific property in question here, Lot 1184E. Following the partition, the property didn't just go directly to the judge. Nope. Step 1, it was awarded to several of the Reyes heirs. Step 2, in July 1964, those heirs sold the lot to a third party, Dr. Arcadio Galopon. And then, Step 3, fast forward to March 1965, and Dr. Galopon sells a portion of this very lot to Judge Asuncion and his wife. Basically, the property went from the heirs to a doctor and eventually right into the hands of the very judge who presided over the initial partition case. Wild, right? That brings us to Part 2, the issue, Article 1491. This is the exact legal dilemma and the core statute behind the complainant's argument. All right, so the crucial point here is this specific statutory prohibition in the Civil Code. Article 1491, paragraph 5. It clearly states that judges cannot acquire by purchase, even at a public or judicial auction, property and rights that are in litigation before the court within whose jurisdiction they exercise their functions. It's a fundamental rule, right? It's designed to prevent conflicts of interest and to stop the exploitation of judicial power. Well, Bernardita Macariola argued absolutely yes. She actually filed a verified complaint against Judge Asuncion, charging him with acts unbecoming a judge. She insisted that his purchase of Lot 1184-E was totally illegal because, well, he was the guy who adjudicated that exact lot. This leaves us directly into how the Supreme Court had to interpret the precise wording of this rule. The golden question: was the property still in litigation when he bought it? Which brings us to Part 3, the application, pendency versus finality. Let's look at the court's reasoning and see how they actually interpreted the statute. What's really fascinating here is how the court maps out the crucial distinction between active pendency and a final closed judgment. You see, for a property to be considered in litigation, the case must still be active. The appeal period has to still be running, but once a judgment becomes final and is no longer appealable, boom, the litigation ceases to exist. The property is just regular property again. It completely sheds its in litigation status. Law students, please take note of this exact Supreme Court quote. It is literally the cornerstone of the case. The court ruled that, for the prohibition to operate, the sale or assignment of the property must take place during the pendency of the litigation. The prohibition doesn't just stretch into eternity. It is strictly bounded by the active lifespan of the court case. 16. That's the number of months, well, over a year, between the final partition order in November 1963 and the judge's purchase in March 1965. Why does this number matter so much? Because it mathematically proves that the pendency period had long expired. By the time the judge actually bought the land, the case was completely closed. The original decision was rendered on June 8, 1963, and crucially, none of the parties, including the complainant, Bernardita Macariola, filed an appeal within the reglementary period. Since there was no appeal, the decision became absolute and final, and those later orders approving the partition, they became final too. So, applying the strict rule to the facts, the Supreme Court reasoned that the property was legally stripped of its in-litigation status long before Judge Asuncion ever entered the picture as a buyer. The 1963 decision was final, the partition was unappealed, and, breaking the chain of direct influence, the judge bought the land from Dr. Galopon, a third party, not the litigants themselves. Plus, there was absolutely no evidence that Dr. Galopon was just some dummy buyer secretly acting for the judge.
Moving to Part 4, the conclusion, the final verdict. So what's the ultimate takeaway from this digest? We've established the facts and applied the letter of the law. Let's see the result.
Legally speaking, the judge was entirely cleared of violating the Civil Code prohibition. Because of the exact timing of his purchase, which took place well after the finality of the decision, the Supreme Court definitively held there was no violation of Article 1491. Under the strict literal interpretation of the statute, Judge Asuncion committed zero legal wrong by buying the property. However, the court introduced a super important ethical nuance here, and this brilliantly illustrates the difference between what is technically legal and what is ethical for a member of the judiciary. The court reminded the judge of Canon 3 of the Canons of Judicial Ethics. While his act was strictly legal, buying recently litigated property from a case in your own court and then soon after transferring it to a corporation where he and his wife were officers, well, it definitely raises some eyebrows. The court noted it was unwise and indiscreet, and strongly reminded him that a judge's conduct must be free even from the appearance of impropriety. To wrap up your case digest, you really need to remember these critical points for your Constitution I syllabus. First, strict statutory interpretation relies heavily on facts and timelines. Second, under Article 1491, in litigation strictly means active pendency, not past history. And third, members of the judiciary face this heavy dual burden. They must not only follow the strict letter of the law, but they've also got to balance that with maintaining the appearance of ethical decorum to preserve public trust. I'll leave you with this thought for your next recitation. Can a legal action still be ethically questionable even if it strictly complies with the law? How far should the appearance of impropriety dictate a judge's private life? Think deeply about that tension. If you found this explainer helpful for your law studies, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into case digests. See you in the next one.